Without further delay, thank you so much for joining us as a part of the Feminist Art Field School. And I wonder if we could start with the broadest question, which is, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to talk with you all. White Cohuitep request Tania Willard slaka klaweka na nasgain esh na Secwépemc utluch. So I'm Tania Willard. I'm an artist and curator. I'm greeting you here from Secwépemc utluch, my home territories. And we refer to our land base as Secwépemc utluch, which refers not only to the geography of the land, but to our culture and language, as taught to me by Gary Godfredson, Secwépemc poet. So it's the center of a lot of my practice these days. So I want to also introduce you to my lands that are beaming into you in this Zoom format.
Thank you so much. I wonder, I mean, I could sort of ask this question in a leading way based on my knowledge of what you do. I want to ask you to talk about Bush Gallery and your work at UBC Okanagan, but I also just want to sort of broadly ask you to talk a little bit about your practice, so that everybody can get a sense of all that you do. And there's probably a lot that I don't even know about. So feel free to expand on beyond Bush Gallery and your teaching if you feel so inspired.
Sure. Teaching is recent. Maybe I'll talk about that last. But Bush Gallery, yeah, you're reaching me at my heart and at my home, which is this project that is collaborative in nature called Bush Gallery, that I collaborate with other artists, including Peter Morin, Gabriel Hill, and Janine Freyne-Jutli, as well as my family, as well as the non-human and the land here itself. So I really think through an animate and interrelated lens when I think about this project of Bush Gallery. And it really started from being able to, it started from a kind of an opportunity in terms of having the recognition and the shows that were touring. So I had curated a show, for example, Beat Nation, Art, Hip Hop, and Aboriginal Culture. And it toured, and that was fantastic, and it brought lots of artists to the gallery. But I also felt like what was going on in major city centers in terms of the tour relating back to home. And it was not easy for me to draw those threads together. And so there's a lot of reasons why people are displaced from their home communities. And an Indian reserve is certainly not the entire context of our territory, but we find ourselves on reserves with very limited employment opportunities, economies. People are reeling now from the kinds of impacts that COVID-19 has had, which are very serious. But we've had rates of unemployment on reserve over 50% and higher for many, 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 not years, but generations. So the work was meant to point to the ways in which the cultural economy operates almost entirely outside of Indigenous territory. Well, it operates within Indigenous territories in terms of like on Indigenous lands, but not on reserves. And there's still such a kind of a gap between these places that I found myself. And so I wanted to try to find ways that both interrogated that space, but also for myself, tried to make that space, perhaps more woven together. And so as a mom with 2 young kids, it also was impractical traveling for these shows. I am an adherent to what they call attachment parenting, which is, I think, many of the ways that people parented in Indigenous and continue to parent in Indigenous and, localized communities. And so, we don't necessarily have this space. We don't necessarily make the space in galleries for breastfeeding. And I found myself like needing to take breaks while I was curating to breastfeed, having to do a talk, and then my child being really upset at 5 months. And so I decided to breastfeed while I was doing the talk with an audience, which is great, but was actually a struggle for me in terms of the ways in which expectations, mean that I thought like, I didn't, I was nervous about doing that or shy about doing that. And so all these things sort of culminated in wanting to move back home in my territory and wanting to make, and really questioning, well, why can't I make space for art here, in the rural, on reserve, those spaces that's not New York and Paris, right? These ways in which we still locate like the center of kind of cosmopolitan art. And I have big questions about that. What does that mean? Who does that leave out when we kind of adhere to those expectations or, preoccupations in our field? And so for me, the Bush Gallery project was as much about being in place as well as questioning those ideas. And so I always thought of it as like, you can kind of make your own Bush Gallery space wherever. And I didn't think I was doing anything totally new, just building on the ways in which, people still harvest materials and make baskets and do things that are with the land as a kind of, if I really think through Secwépemc aesthetics and ideas that I've learned, I realized that the only kind of concept of gallery would be the land. And I'll just add this, that recently I had a chance to translate this manifesto we first wrote for Bush Gallery. And, we used a number of kind of art terms and ideas in there. And I worked with Elder Flora Sampson and language instructor Janice Dick-Billy to translate what we wrote into Secwépemc's gene. So into my language and into the language of the land here. And it was really interesting to get around these ideas. And we were translating just the idea of Bush Gallery. And Flora Sampson came up with a phrasing that kind of in English means like a place you go and harvest. And, the way in which these parallels were drawn, harvesting materials for artwork or materials for our sustenance, the parallels between that kind of holistic way of engaging with our lands is something that, I really work towards. And it's an opportunity for me as well to kind of make space for resurgence in my work. We have to all negotiate space and time and money, right? And so I just said, this is what I'm going to do. This is where I'm going to make space, because these are things that I believe in.
Oh, thank you so much. And I want to immediately ask you questions about the Bush Manifesto, but I'm going to hold it. I'm going to say it out loud and hold it and start with a broader question and then move toward the more micro questions that are animating my thinking since I had the opportunity to read everything that you've offered to us for this conversation. And, my question is, you think out loud about the categories of pedagogy and field and land-based practice and art and aesthetics and feminism. And I was wondering, could you tell us in the context of this conversation in some of the ways that those terms, categories, modes of political being relate to you and your work?
Yeah, well, part of that translating, I'll get back to the manifesto quickly, just because part of translating it was translating the word feminism, because we write in the manifesto, Bush Gallery is feminist. And, because I start from this place as a mother, as wanting to make space, within the kind of push and pulls of the domestic as well. And so I tried to translate this idea of feminism, which was an interesting one to think about. And we came up with like chachat nochoch, which is a kind of like, it's kind of like an importance and a strength and a sacredness for women at Bush Gallery. And so those are just deeply intertwined for me, the importance of and the space of feminism. I'll say that not without a critique of feminism, right? In terms of the ways in which it didn't, in the earlier stages, kind of make enough space for Indigenous, Black, people of color within those practices. But it's still something that I think is really important, that allows us to question the kind of impacts of patriarchy and colonialism within our communities. So I might be losing track of your question now. I wanted to tell you about translating feminism, and then
yes, it's spectacular. And then I wonder, perhaps I can prompt you to think too about the way in which school or pedagogies relate to your Bush Gallery based initiatives.
Yeah. Well, I'll say that Bush Gallery pre-exists my kind of, well, my engagement with formal pedagogy in terms of the institution. So I come from doing a lot of community work and socially engaged practice, and so Bush Gallery was really also just the logical and practical way to engage a project in a rural area, that it would involve other people and communities. That's just how I work. But then I started teaching about 3 years ago with UBC Okanagan, which continues to be a journey and a learning. But with Bush Gallery, we were already doing pedagogy in terms of not only, I think, the overall philosophy that we were proposing, that I think is important as both a critique and opening up of different kinds of space and ways of thinking. But also we would do like projects. We, in 1 year, we had Peter Morin and Gabriel Hill come up, and we did a project. I wanted to do a bit of a field trip. Speaking of field school, a field trip to where Daphne Ojig painted her work, Indian in Transition. And she lived in my territory. For the rest of her life, when she passed, she was in the Syilx Okanagan territories. But for many years, she lived in the Shuswap. And in fact, she's the first artist I ever sort of heard of. So my auntie and uncle were engaged in political work in our community. And I remember them talking, I must have only been 5 or 6, talking about Daphne Ojig and talking about her and saying, yeah, well, artists think quite differently than us. And, I don't really remember all the conversation, but I remember that for some reason. And so I had never been out. She had a cabin on Shuswap Lake. And which is also interesting because most of those cabiners are non-native folks and within our territories, and there's definitely issues there. But so we went out and it was kind of this performative pedagogy where we visited the cabin where she painted this work. And I later learned that like people from our community helped drum that painting out because she had to bring it out in sections. It now hangs in Ottawa. And so we called that performance work, which wasn't for an audience, but just we had some documentation of it in non-fiction. Some of the ideas we're at now from that painting stage where it was about the Indian in transition and all these pressures of modernizing and all the loaded colonial ways of thinking about that. And then so we decided that we were on vacation for that work. So pedagogy, so we always have this kind of, and in other instances we looked at some of the conversations and gatherings that Indart produced with Gerald McMaster and I think Edward Patras and stuff years ago out in Saskatchewan, I believe. And so there's these different ways in which we engage with Indigenous art histories, more specifically at Bush Gallery. But I think that really my kind of pedagogical kind of pull comes from activism and community work. That natural way in which you just are a conduit for bringing people together and for learning things together. And so my approach is always to share the knowledge that each of us carries, and certainly not to think that I can necessarily speak as some kind of expert in any area. I continue to be a learner in my home territories, a learner of language, a learner of the land, and that's many other ways in which pedagogy has occurred in my work is also through just experience on the land. So, and that informs this interest in land-based ways of working in terms of a research focus, which is only the words I use now, right? Before it was just what I was doing as an artist and what I was doing as a community member. And then I have these new vocabularies to gain within the institutional space.
Well, maybe speaking of vocabularies and thinking about what you said earlier on in that answer about feminism and its sort of sometimes failure to recognize the struggles of different kinds of women, whether Black, whether Indigenous. I'm thinking about 2 of the articles that you have shared with us, Leanne Simpson's Land as Pedagogy, Anishinabeg Intelligence and Rebellious Transformation, and a Black feminist statement by the, and it's funny because this is the second time somebody has given me this statement to read, and I have no idea how to pronounce the name of the collective. Is it Combahee River Collective?
That's what I've heard it as, Combahee.
Combahee. And thinking about, I read the Black feminist statement, and there was a lot of like, yeah, right on in my head as I was reading it. It's really quite a kind of brilliant analysis of the failures of second wave feminism, and an expression of the needs of Black feminists in the 70s. And there's a line in that statement where they write, if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. And when I started to read Leanne Simpson's writing, I realized that the Black feminist statement, it expresses a lot of the failures of white feminism in a language that is very similar to the way white feminists of the time wrote. And Leanne's writing is a kind of a call for a completely different way of thinking, writing, of being feminist. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm wondering what you think about this particular line from a Black feminist statement, and on a sort of theoretical level, of course, if all systems of oppression were eliminated, we would all be free. But were they speaking from a very particular American perspective? And do you think that there is something very specific about the kinds of oppressions that Indigenous people experience from the Canadian nation state that we really have to think through and make sure is on the table when we talk about dismantling oppression?
I mean, I would say like yes and no, and maybe I'll get into that, but I want to also just comment again from translating I just did this just recently, so I had this line in which was Bush Gallery is an autonomous space for birds. Anyway, and we were trying to translate it, and like this idea of autonomy or freedom wasn't something that the translators I was could articulate because people lived free. We don't have a word because there wasn't like that's life, was to be free on the land, to be free to have your own governance, your own spirituality, your own systems. And so when Leanne Simpson in her writing, really talks about that importance of resurgence and cultural resurgence, and it extends to the forms she uses in her practice, I think, and she continues to be a great inspiration. And yes, things like the Combahee River statement are located in a specific time and place, but I really think that those times and places echo through time, that they carry ripples. And so when I was first, I'm going to try to I can't remember who introduced that to me. May have been Amy Kazmierczak, but somebody put it, sent it my way, and I thought it was really interesting to think about, because I think that so often there can be preconceptions about both Indigenous and people of color, Black people in urbanized places. And I have worked with artists, Black artists, who have pointed to the invisibility of not only Blackness, but also Black women within a kind of the view of Canadiana landscape. Not to mention that Canadiana landscape kind of invisibilizes everyone also, but and so that criticalness it was a student whose work was part of a project I did, and she was talking about the criticalness of Black presence, Black women within the Canadian landscape. And it's just stuck with me to like think about that. And so to think about that, happening in a way that there was more affinity to the land in some ways in that statement from that group was just really exceptional to kind of think about, and to kind of, I try to think about the space of Bush Gallery, which is also my home, which is also that's a kind of already complicated. But I also want it to be this inclusive space, but it's also not a publicly accessible space. And it's not a funded project that it's like funds in different little streams of money for a certain thing over time. So the tension between that and the kinds of thoughts about when lands are inclusive or not accessible, and that question of we only know freedom as something to compare being unfree against. And I also remember the Haida elder Lavina White talking about, it was during the Gustafson Lake standoff, and the Citation defenders were touring in Victoria, actually. This happened to talk. And she was saying, her talk was really beautiful. And she was like, I remember being free as a kid. She talked about being a child, and that this memory of freedom was something that carried her through her struggle today, that she knew that things were different and could be different. Then I was on this talk some time ago with the trans American artist, Tourmaline, and she was talking about I really loved the way she framed it, this idea of like, what is your freedom dream, and this idea that looks kind of like ask the impossible. I'm probably not doing a great job of kind of summarizing, but just the way she positioned that was so beautiful to talk about. I think in her work she talks about sometimes the politics of pleasure, and when you're in a marginalized group, right, that often people see as victims, like claiming a space for pleasure and joy, which in part has some impact on Bush Gallery. One of the reasons I wanted to bring people here and stuff was that it was easier to have my kids run around. It's what brings me joy, to be on the land, to learn language, to learn things about the plants around me. That's kind of an abundance, when oftentimes otherwise we're in different kind of austerity and scarcity. And I think we've come to believe that under capitalism. And so, so for me to like sit here and think, like just this morning, there was a bear back here and just where I'm looking right now, but like to think about that level of freedom that comes with responsibility, right? And comes with respect, with reciprocity and all these things, that I'm learning as much from that experience. It's like this idea of like decolonial, anti-colonial, and then like pre-colonial, as in like we don't even have a way to describe that as against, because it's just the way we were. And that's and can be, and that's kind of a beautiful thing to just be, right? When we have all these complicated things around politics and identity and oppression, like sometimes the joy is just to be. And I think at least sometimes I think that I can just do that when I'm here. I don't have to be like, oh, I'm the Indigenous curator, and I'm also of settler ancestry, so I'm also mixed, so I'm the Indigenous curator, and I'm like trying to like sell you a new car, as in like sell you on coming into the gallery. And like I just didn't want to be in that role anymore. I wanted to just center the work differently. And I think things like the Combahee River statement, Leanne Simpson's writing, they center us differently, and it can be easier to get somewhere or to be fulfilled under that differential center than it is trying to like move from a different center and like fight your way out. It's like a gravitational pull or something, a whirlpool maybe.
I love this so much. And, it's connected to what was going to be my question about the Combahee River Collective statement. And, oh, I see that I am frozen. Is that true? Or are we back? We're okay?
Now you're back.
Okay.
Sometimes my connection will drop out.
No problem. Oh, is everything okay on your end, Michelle? It might be me too.
Tania just froze for me, but you're okay.
I'm back now, I think. My satellite internet polluting the night sky with Elon Musk's Starlink.
Oh my goodness, I know, aren't we all? I'll start my question or statement again, which is to say, one of the things that I love so much about your inclusion of the Combahee River Collective statement and my reading of the Bush Gallery Manifesto and thinking about manifestos and collective writing in general is just that they're a polyvocal, multi-authored pursuit. And it strikes me that's another way to radically decenter or radically think against some of these structures, gallery-based structures, institutional-based structures, which tells you who can be where and at what time. And from the beginning of your self-summary, you talked about collaboration as such a foundational part of your practice. And I would love to learn more about how collaboration functions and flourishes in some of the artwork and art making that you do.
Yeah, well, normally it's first of all, I consider the collaboration like just in terms of like being in a space and placed in my home territories and like, I have pets, I have kids, I have ecologies around me. So that's like an omnipresent thing. But in terms of like the practicalities of like making work that we may show later in an exhibition or something, that usually happens through a res. I like to say that because we're on reserve, residency model. And so I bring people together here for usually like no more than a week. And so there's an immediacy to what we're doing. There's like, a time frame that's tight. And we're trying to negotiate that also with, some artists have their own kids they bring. And so we kind of negotiate the labor of being together. And in terms of like that being important to the process as well, making food together, cleaning up, that kind of what often gets, divided off as the domestic space is kind of really important to our process. So we work in this way of like being together quite kind of immersively and in this place, though we have done iterations of Bush Gallery, which I then in my mind carve off as this other kind of thing, which I call Citation, S-I-T-E. So that plays with the ideas of text citation. And this kind of comes from a kind of negotiation I did with not necessarily wanting to talk about or bring Bush Gallery into the space of the institution, but wanting to bring some ideas present within it. And so this idea of site-specific institute art practice, but starting with a basis of Indigenous territoriality, and then text, the play on text citation made a lot of sense for me. So when Bush Gallery kind of, or this in my mind is how we work, is like when Bush Gallery does something in other Indigenous territories where lots of the times we don't have time to necessarily create, if we don't already have them, deeper relationships with Indigenous communities, then we engage in this kind of practice of citation, where we do what we can to kind of put local Indigenous territoriality and people into some kind of frame within our work. And sometimes that also means we did this Toronto Art Biennial project, and we hired like teenagers from the local reserve who had a company that was like outdoor cinema. And so, we'll do that instead of institutions that may be easier to source sometimes. But for us, it's like, well, how can we contribute if like, residencies can be great. I'm thinking about Banff residency or something where you go and like there's, meals prepared and it's this amazing space, and that's fantastic. But first of all, I can't offer that, in this space. But also I just then also think about like the privilege of that, I guess. I don't mean to like artists absolutely deserve that, but I think about it just in terms of like how I would arrive at those spaces, but then I'd be back home living in a log cabin, you know, my dad built on the res, and those again, this kind of like space in between was difficult to navigate at times. And so I just like, I'm just trying to pull things like closer together in a way that makes sense for me sometimes. And so collaboration, yeah, we literally just make like things together. So we're in the same space and time. We're often using materiality here, whether it's plant or natural material or like garbage and refuse and different kinds of, and or leftovers, different kinds of material. So, you know, in that case, there is, it can be hard to keep track of authorship at times. We'll be like, oh yeah, who did that, or who first said that, or how did, you know, so but that's like when I think collaboration is so deep, is like you feel like you started thinking in somebody else's mind and you're like, who actually said that? Because we have a record of it and we're doing it now, but like I don't remember where it first kind of came from, you know. Hive mind.
And you said it too early on in your engagement with the question about collaboration. You said it's actually about being together, not doing something. And I think it's so true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then often like what we can only do so much grant writing about what we're going to do, because what happens when we come together is different. Like in this most recent time, we came together in July, and when Gabrielle was traveling here with her daughter, they were coming through from the coast at night, and it was a lightning storm and a wildfire had broken out, and she could see a line of flame on the mountain, and she was like, should I be coming all the way through? So we had to make a pit stop in Kamloops, which is nearby. But so the works that we did most recently, engaged with the experience of, and this is not the only time, of kind of wildfire season here in the summer, and that kind of anxiety and experience of that. So, as much as it's what we're doing together, it's like the big together as humans, together as people with other beings in this landscape. So, like right now, I don't know if you can hear ravens in the background, but ravens are really busy because the Kikini are running in the stream nearby me.
Well, you took the conversation kind of exactly to the place that I think my next question would have taken it, because I was going to comment on sort of how much joy and hope there is in the way you talk about Bush Gallery and your relationship to the land, but that of course there's a narrative running underneath about what is happening to the land, represented in the form of increasing numbers of fires, wildfires, and there's a huge protest at Fairy Creek on Vancouver Island, which is sort of really bringing into focus how complex this situation is around the land, because there are lots of people protesting the logging of old growth forests, but in so doing, they're questioning the rights of the Indigenous community whose territory that growth of trees is on, to make a living from logging those trees. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you balance the hopefulness and joy of your relationship to the land with all of these things that are happening in the world and threatening your territory and all Indigenous territories.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I always struggle with like not doing enough, and then I have to go like, okay, but I'm doing something, and there are a lot of people doing nothing. So, you have to kind of balance that all out at times, because I don't feel like I could ever do enough. There's so many pressures, and has been for, since the onset of settler colonialism in our territories. We hear about things in the news like wildfires, and we hear about things like or hopefully we do, about the ongoing Secwépemc protest against the Canada-owned TMX pipeline. And those are really serious, and I contribute in ways that I can to those. But I also want to acknowledge all the people that are doing the really difficult frontline work that is extraordinary, and that I think at times we only can do in bursts because it's really challenging work. So their work on front lines as warriors is so important, but they need people behind that to support, so fundraisers, like building economies locally, speaking out, those are all things I hope that I'm contributing to do too, as well as language resurgence and knowing the land and practicing harvest and stuff on the land. Those are subtler, more ongoing way, completely subversive activities, because if you read through like Secwépemc histories, like that's what we've been fighting for 150 years, is being fenced out of our territories, and that fight comes from our love and the joy that brings, right? And so I think the only way I can kind of be sustained in some of that work is to have those experiences that are not also not necessarily like what do I want to say, like, it's not like going on vacation or something, right? It's not like comfortable, but you're engaged and you're challenged, like being out on the land. And in the end, those become really valuable experiences, sort of more valuable than complete leisure, though there's nothing wrong with people taking vacations, like go for it. We all need it. But yeah, so like, I think that this project has become more important because I need to give it the space in order to balance out what is also hard work. And it's totally imperfect also, and totally not meant to be romantic either. Like, oh, I'm living in harmony with the natural landscape. Some things are really challenging at times, right? Like deer ate my entire garden. like 140 tomatoes, like 40 cucumber plants. Like, I need to build a fence, but I hate fences. So and I've tried the whole, this is for them, this area, and that doesn't work. So there's lots of practicalities too that challenge ideologies, I think, out here, that keep me humble, which is a good Secwépemc value, is like to be humble, to be on the same level as things. So but yeah, that there's constant tension, there's constant conflict. I probably have it easier than my ancestors did. And I need to be able to be in a place where I can not be self-destructive, but I can pass these things on to my family. And that, of course, for many marginalized communities, like, that's already a win when we're not self-destructive, right? And it sometimes takes a little while, or for many communities, just that is like overcoming many kinds of obstacles that kind of hyper competitive capitalist economy kind of brings upon us. So it's like, I just keep trying. I just keep going. And I also think about futurity in that even though this is a small piece of land that is impacted, it is and can be a future, and is and can be abundance, in the same way that, like, here with the knowledge of it can be. So I don't know, those are just things I carry with me in my being that I think give me so much perspective, that I think there's something valuable for other people in it as well.
140 tomatoes is not an insignificant amount of produce for a deer to eat.
They eat the tops and then they don't blossom out and make tomatoes. However, they had a lot of pressure, all the wildfires and everything, because I've grown lots of cucumbers before. I've grown even tomatoes before, and they not bothered them. But this time a family found it, and they had a good time.
Yeah, have to get what you need.
Yep.
So you've alluded to the role of the institution and institutions in your life in a number of ways, be it through thinking through art institutions or your presence in academia. And I wonder, how do you think about the role of institutions in the work that you do?
Challenging, like so getting back to not just ideology, like we have to make a living in world. And I'm resistant to push projects here into what I know, which is like also not for profits and arts organizations and ways of working, and those things have an important place, but they come with different kinds of pressures and needs to kind of fit into models that if I want to really challenge, I need to create space from. So I'm able to compartmentalize that, though. If I have a project, I can kind of compartmentalize and let things overflow into more institutional practices. But I mean, I am excited about the idea of a lineage of knowledge. That's what excites me, and about valuing that. That's what excites me about an institution. It's just that that lineage of knowledge is still really racist. So, I've experienced that institutions are places of racism as much as they are also places of challenging racism, and that can be difficult to be in, and it can be really rewarding in terms of what we're bringing, in terms of just what we're bringing when we're in those spaces, I hope. And so it continues to be a bit of an experiment for me. But I think as long as I can have another thing to balance it out with, like in terms of my research, in terms of my life here, it can balance out for me. That's not to say I don't value those experiences, but I'm really also inspired by projects like Decentering, Center for Teaching and Technology, colloquially called Bush University, which I first heard about from a language instructor here, and which probably predates this idea of Bush Gallery for me. And I didn't know a lot about the project. I just heard her mention that, and it set off all kinds of like signals for me of being like, whoa, right, wait a minute. Like everything that my dad knows about hunting taught to him by his grandfather is PhD level. You know what I mean? And they really create those comparisons. They have professors who know the land in that project, and then they also work with Leanne Simpson teaches there, Glenn Coulthard, who Glenn's part of UBC Vancouver. So that helps me see the kinds of places that people can carve out that can be so completely revolutionary, even when contained in an institution. The problem is that maybe the institution doesn't even recognize how great sometimes that work is, and doesn't let it kind of fully inform other spaces that are still very conservative. But again, you just keep going.
So now is the time in the conversation when we get to ask you what you're working on now, what you're working on next, what you're looking forward to.
Yeah, well, so from that residency in July, we created a number of works, as well as through a residency with York University, and some work with graduate research assistants. We created an exhibition that's on right now as part of Momenta Biennial in Montreal. And that's been really fantastic, because it ended up bringing a lot of different things together. So it's a large show. It includes this work in translations. We are finishing up a zine for that. It includes translations of the manifesto in French, Ganiaga, Mohawk, and Secwépemc. And I've learned so much through that process of translating within my community that gives me so much more to think about for Bush Gallery. And a long overdue project, which was funded through a land-based community art fund at BC Arts Council, that was delayed due to COVID, like many things, that I hope to hope to finally get time to move forward with. And that was a project learning cedar root basketry. So as well as Secwépemc language curriculum. So we worked with Elder Dolores Purdaby, who's a brilliant basket maker. And she did some tutorials that we recorded. And so we're developing these kits. So, you know, sometimes I'm inviting artists here and but once in a while I also have projects that are really kind of community based. So we'll have some honorariums for people to learn both the Secwépemc curriculum, which will also contribute to the society that I'm a part of, ʷəŋən, which is Nisconlith based. Also Secwépemc, but it's particularly our reserve community language program. So we will hopefully be making some, beautiful cedar root baskets, which some of my first projects when I came home was with Elder Dolores Purdaby, who's an amazing artist in basketry. And I learned birch bark harvesting and birch bark basket making from her. And so it's so exciting to work with her again and to work in this other form of basketry, which continues to give me, again, so much insight. You know, it's what I want to say, like several textbooks in one or something. You know, you're learning to harvest, when to harvest, you're learning about how things grow when they face the sun, or which sides are sheltered, and how to then form that into something like a vessel that then you can, you know, for me, I use it a lot symbolically or metaphorically with Bush Gallery, that because once you have that basket, you can store things in there, right? So stores all these beautiful experiences, ideas, and stories. So I hope that that project is able to get going this fall, and then I don't plan much further ahead than that. That's also the beauty of Bush Gallery. I'm not writing a 3-year grant right now, though I'm thinking about it these days. But anyway, because it can otherwise be difficult to hold to that methodology where it's like, I really celebrate and invite happenstance or serendipity, like or letting things happen and people come together when is the right time. And that can be hard to do when you're planning, though there's ways to do it, I think, where you can make space. But anyway, but that's one of the things that was also joyful in Bush Gallery for me, is like not doing the same kind of logistics, administrative tasks that were ahead of me in curatorial work. It allows some freedom of like things just flowing and being, which is, it's a different way of working that has its own challenges, but also, I think, for me, more rewards.
I think happenstance and serendipity are extraordinary places to leave our conversation today and to think about what's possible in that space. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to spend this time with you and to learn more about your practice. Thank you for hanging out with us in this way.
Oh, such a pleasure. I'm so excited to get a chance to speak with both of you and to have others think through these things.
So nice to see you again.